Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamu alaikum. Dear student teachers, this is lecture 9 of Functional English 1, and this is meant for the students who are doing associate degree in education. Lecture 9 is about asking for and giving advice. Before we even go further, I would like to point out here that you should look at the spelling of advice here. It is A-D-V-I-C-E, advice. And you must have come across another word which is A-D-V-I-S-E, and it is pronounced as advise. So I hope you know the difference between advice and advise. Advice with C is a noun, advise with S is a verb. So right from the beginning you should know the difference between advice and advise. Advise is a verb and advice is a noun. In this lecture we are going to ask for, that means we are going to ask for advice when we need an advice, what kind of expressions we can use. And we are also going to learn how to give advice to someone in English. But before we start lecture number 9, let's have a quick look at what we learned in lecture number 8. In lecture 8, we learned how to evaluate classroom instructions. In fact, we looked at one of the imagined teachers, Simon, who was giving instructions in his classroom, and we tried to analyze and evaluate whether his techniques are effective or not. Then we also learned what are the ways to give clear classroom instructions. Then we learned how to order classroom instructions. We also learned what kind of questions we should ask in order to find out whether the students are following the instructions or not. Then we also analyzed some instructional manuals, instruction manuals. We looked at various kind of instruction manuals, and we also analyzed what kind of things are involved in it. And finally, we learned some tips on how to write instruction manuals. And I also gave you some situations that you can use for practice. So this is what we learned in lecture number 8. Now we move on to lecture number 9. The objectives of lecture number 9 are, if you pay attention to it and if you follow the instructions that I give, you should be able to ask for advice. You should be able to give advice. You should be able to give recommendations, and you should also be able to offer help. Now, I think I can hardly overemphasize the importance of giving and taking advice, because as teachers, usually we are also career counselors. So we often give advice about which subjects our students should study and which stream of education they should adopt, and we give advice on many things actually. And as teachers, as professionals, we also need advice in many areas. For example, we are looking for scholarships, we are looking for new job opportunities, we want to improve our professional skills, so we are looking for professional seminars and other opportunities. And for that, we need advice from the people who are professional. And even in the classroom, you know, as teachers, whenever you go into the classroom, often you have to give advice to students on various issues, on various social and moral issues as well. So this is really important. And I think one of the important speech functions that we perform is taking and giving advice. Okay, so we start. We look at the key phrases for advice. When we have to ask for advice, what are the key phrases that we can use? And you know that I have been emphasizing it in the past that you should note down these key phrases because they are really essential. Whenever you have to ask for advice, you should actually use them. I have written them in the form of complete sentences, but the phrases are bold, so you can note down the whole sentences or you can just note down the phrases themselves. For example, the common key phrase which is used for asking for advice is, what do you suggest we do this evening? So what do you suggest or what do you recommend is the common way of asking for advice. What do you suggest we do this evening? What do you suggest we do this evening? What do you recommend we do this evening? Okay, another useful phrase is, what should I do when I am in Karachi? What should I do when I am doing my course? What should I do when I am doing my course? What ought I do on Sunday? What ought I do on Sundays? Could you recommend a good restaurant near here? Could you recommend a good restaurant near here? Or you can change it. You can use, could you recommend a good tourist spot near here? Could you recommend a good tourist attraction near here? Similarly, we can ask, could you suggest somewhere to go for a hike? Could you suggest somewhere to go for a hike? And you know what hike means? How many of you like hiking? Okay, good. So hike is like going up on the mountains. Usually you walk on the mountains. That is called hiking. So could you suggest somewhere to go for a hike? Do you know the quickest way to train station? So the useful phrase is, do you know? Do you know the quickest way to the train station? So in fact, when you say do you know, you are not really asking a question. It might be a question, but in the context, it might also be used for asking for advice. Do you have any advice on visiting the Natural History Museum? Do you have any advice on visiting the Natural History Museum? Could you advise me on the best way to get to the clock tower? Could you advise me to the best way to get to the clock tower? What's your advice on hitchhiking in Pakistan? What's your advice on hitchhiking in Pakistan? And I hope you know what hitchhiking means. Yeah, we have talked about hiking earlier, but this time it is a hitchhiking. So does anyone know what hitchhiking means? Hitchhiking is a mode of travel in which a traveler takes lift from various vehicles in order to go somewhere. So a traveler does not have a vehicle of his or her own, and he takes lift, stands beside the road and puts his thumb like this and takes lift either from a tractor, from a truck, from a car, a bus, or anything, sometimes even maybe a donkey cart, or a bicycle or a motorbike. So this is a mode of traveling. It is a kind of adventure in which a traveler travels by taking lift in various vehicles. So the question again is, what's your advice on hitchhiking in Pakistan? So I would like you to note down all the bold type phrases here. They are very useful asking for advice. So next time, if you are asking for any job opportunity, if you are asking for any scholarships, if you are asking for any piece of advice, you should actually use these key phrases and structures in your own English. Okay, so these are key phrases for asking for advice. Now we move on and we look at key phrases of giving advice. For giving advice, very often you can use "why don't you?" For example, why don't you take admission in a language course? Why don't you take admission in a language course? This is "why don't you" here is used for giving advice. Okay, another advice is, you could eat less and do more exercise. You could eat less and do more exercise. So you could actually is a phrase here. How about applying for the scholarship? How about applying for the scholarship? So how about is the useful phrase here, and after how about usually we use the ing form of the verb. So we can say, how about playing tennis? How about going out? How about studying abroad? How about joining a gym? So you can use how about, and after that we use ing form of the verb. And you know, these giving advice phrases are closer to what we studied earlier when we studied how to make suggestions. In fact, we used some of these phrases. In fact, giving advice is like giving a suggestion. So there is no wonder why the phrases are identical or sometimes even the same. Okay, if you want to be more formal, you can even say, I suggest, I recommend that you opt for biology rather than computer science. You can say, I suggest that you opt for biology rather than computer science. Or you can say, I recommend that you opt for biology rather than computer science. The word that is optional. So you can say, I suggest you opt for biology rather than computer science. That will be equally okay. All right, we move on. Another useful phrase is you should or you ought to. So you can say, you should eat less meat, I think. You should not smoke, I believe. You ought to quit smoking, I think. Okay. Another useful way of giving advice is an indirect way, and that is saying, if I were you, I would avail the opportunity. So the phrase is, if I were you, I would. If I were you, I would. So you can say, if I were you, I would go abroad. If I were you, I would avail the opportunity. If I were you, I would work harder. Okay, another key phrase for giving advice is you'd better. You'd better is actually the short form of you would better, or you had better. Sorry, not you had better. You'd better means you would better. So you'd better join some professional organization means that I suggest that you join some professional organizations. Better join some professional organization. The key phrase here is you'd better, and you'd better is the short form of you would better. This is another way of giving advice. So I repeat, here are the useful phrases for giving advice again. Why don't you? You could. How about? I suggest that you. You should, or you ought to. If I were you, I would. You'd better. Okay, now I suppose that next time you have to give advice, you will use these key phrases and structures. Okay, we move on. Now I want you to practice the key phrases that you have learnt. And here are some prompts for practice. And do you remember what prompts mean? Yeah, prompts means clues. So I'm going to give you some situations. You can think of them as practice situations. I'm going to give you some situations for practice. But what I would like you to do is, I would give you a problem, and before you give me an advice on that problem, you would repeat what you have studied earlier, and that is how to respond when you listen to a bad news. So naturally, if I give you a problem, if I tell you one of my problems, naturally you should react to it, you should respond to it before you give any advice. So do you remember, in one of the earlier lectures we learned how to respond to a bad news, how to say sorry. I hope you remember that. So if for example I say, I've got a headache, so in response to this you can say, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, sorry to hear that. So this first part would be reacting or responding to this problem, and then in the second part you can give an advice. So what advice do you think is suitable if I've got a headache? You can say, oh, you ought to take some rest. Or you can say, oh, you'd better take some rest. Or you can even make an offer. You can say, should I bring some aspirin for you? Should I bring a cup of tea for you? So you can actually do lots of things. You can respond to this problem. It's a bad news. So when you hear a bad news, you can share your feelings. You can respond to it. Then you can give an advice. And finally, you can also give an offer if you want to. So I repeat, I've got a headache. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Why don't you take a cup of tea? Why don't you take some rest? If I were you, I would take some rest. You ought to take some rest. Should I bring a cup of coffee for you? Should I bring a cup of coffee for you? So you see, you can use all these phrases. Let's move on to the next phrase, the next problem. I've lost my car keys. I've lost my car keys. Oh, that's terrible. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, what a pity. So you can express your genuine concern by asking one of these phrases. What a pity. I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, what a nuisance. Okay. And then you can give advice. You can practice the key phrases that we learned earlier. So how would you give an advice if I say, I've lost my car keys? Why don't you check it in the drawer? Why don't you check it in the drawer? Why don't you check it on your table? Why don't you check it on the table? How about looking for the keys in the drawer? How about looking for them in your pocket? Okay, and here you can also make an offer. You can say, should I look for the keys for you? Should I look them for you? Should I find them for you? Should I search them for you? Okay, here is the next problem. I've lost my original ID card. Oh, what a pity. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Oh, what a nuisance. And then you can give an advice by saying, oh, you must report it to the police station. You must file an FIR. You ought to go to the nearest police station and file an FIR. And then you can make an offer. You can say, should I accompany you? Should I go with you? Should I talk to someone? Okay, another problem could be, I can't find my glasses. I can't find my glasses. And in response to this, you can give an advice like, when were you wearing them last time? When do you remember you were wearing them last time? Why don't you look for your glasses in your office? Why don't you look for your glasses in your bag? You can have all these key structures to frame pieces of advice and offers. Now try it a little bit more. I've lost my job. You can respond to it by saying, oh, really? Oh, don't tell me. These responses are expressions of surprise that you don't believe it. But you can also add your pieces of advice after that. You should look for a new job. You should start your own business. Why don't you start your own business? You ought to start your own business. How about joining my company? How about joining my organization? So this is an offer. Okay, if someone says, I've got a flat tire. You know what flat tire means? Yes, you guessed it right. When the tire of your car is punctured, the proper expression for that in English is, so if I say, I've got a flat tire, how would you respond to it? But before your response, what do you mean by flat tire? Yes, you guessed it right. When the tire of your car is punctured, it is called flat tire. So I've got a flat tire. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. And then you can make a piece of advice. You can say, how about changing the tire? Do you know how to change the tire? Do you know how to change the tire? Should I come over? Should I come over? So we are imagining that someone has got a flat tire, he is standing by the road, he makes a telephone call to you and he says, I've got a flat tire. And in response you say, oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Do you have an extra tire? Do you know how to change it? Should I come over? etc., etc. Okay, very common problem these days. Someone tells you that he or she is gaining weight. What would be your advice? I'm gaining weight. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. You should eat less meat and more vegetables. Or probably you should exercise more. All right, so here you have some prompts for practice, and this is not an exhaustive list. I would like you to note down all the key phrases for asking for advice and also for giving advice in your notebook, and try to use it in your everyday situations, and try to create situations if they don't naturally occur to you, so that you can practice these key phrases. Okay, now we move on, and now we are going to listen to something. And before you listen to an audio clip, I would like you to look at these questions, because after you have listened to the audio, you are going to answer these questions. The audio itself is 6 minutes long, and I would like you to pay attention, and especially to the questions that I have written here. So once you listen to this audio, you should be able to answer all these questions. Question number 1 is, who makes recommendations to Claire? So you probably imagined it already, that there is going to be a dialogue between a speaker and Claire, and someone gave recommendations to Claire. Who is that someone? You will answer to me after listening to the audio. Who makes recommendations to Claire? Question number 2. What are these recommendations about? What are these recommendations about? So, in other words, Claire is seeking recommendation or advice about what topic, what subject. What structures are used for making these recommendations? You have just learned some key phrases and structures. Probably you would learn few more. Maybe some of these will be repeated. So I want you to pay attention to this audio clip, and after listening to it, or while listening to it, you can jot down the structures that have been used for giving directions, recommendations here. Recommendation is just like an advice, but so probably the expressions that you would hear would be similar to what you have learnt already. Okay, the next question is, why is it useful to be vague while recommending something? Okay, it is not always useful, but sometimes it is useful to recommend something. The question you should focus is, when is it useful to be vague while recommending something? Okay. The last question is, what's the major difference between giving instructions and recommending? Okay, so I would like you to note down these questions and keep them in mind while you are listening to the audio. Okay. Alright, now you will listen to the audio clip from BBC Learning English, English Learning, and do you remember that we have listened to audio clips from BBC before? These are taken from a program which is called How To. Okay. Alright, now listen to the audio clip from BBC English Learning.
How To with bbclearningenglish.com. Everyday English for everyday situations.
Hello and welcome to the programme. My name is William Kramer. Now you may have heard another episode of How To in which we looked at how to make positive and negative comments about something. In that programme we heard clips from a conversation between Claire and her boss, Mark. Claire was showing Mark her design for a new website, and he made some positive and negative comments about her work. Well, now it's time for Mark to make some recommendations to Claire, some suggestions for changes. In this first clip, listen carefully to the way that Mark uses the word want.
Structure that leads the audience through, but it gives them the freedom. So you still want all of these links.
Mark says, you still want all of these links. Saying you want in this context is like saying you need. Listen to this example.
What you need is a nice clear structure in the design.
What you want is this. What you need is that. Now let's listen to the way that Mark uses the word could.
Content on the page. So you could vary. The prepare area could look in one particular way. The listen to the program could have another look. The take the challenge.
Mark says that different parts of Claire's design could have a different look, a different style.
Content on the page. So you could vary. The prepare area could look in one particular way. The listen to the program could have another look. The take the challenge could have another look.
As well as could, we can make recommendations using would. Perhaps you already know that one way to make a suggestion is to say, if I were you, I would do this. Or, if I were you, I'd do this. For example, in a restaurant, your friend might say to you,
That seems like a lot of money. If I were you, I'd check the bill.
Now listen to how Mark uses the word would.
So, I mean, what I would do with this is think about a structure, navigational structure that leads.
Mark doesn't say, if I were you, I would, but he says, what I would do is.
So, I mean, what I would do with this is think about a structure, navigational structure that leads.
So, to make a recommendation, you can say, you could do this, or what I would do is that. These are two ways to make a clear and definite suggestion. However, Mark doesn't know exactly what he thinks Claire should change. He just thinks she could think about things in a different way. That's why he says, what I would do is think about.
So, I mean, what I would do with this is think about a structure, navigational structure that leads.
It's useful to be vague. And another way of saying think about that is look at that.
I would take that. I also think, you might want to look at some of the imagery and think about perhaps simplifying that.
You might want to look at some of the imagery, Mark says.
You're listening to How To with bbclearningenglish.com.
So far then, we've looked at several ways you can make recommendations and two structures that you can use to be vague. Part of the reason that Mark is being a little vague is that it softens what he's saying. It makes him seem less bossy because he's making a suggestion rather than telling Claire exactly what to change. Don't forget that Mark is Claire's boss, so he doesn't need to sound very bossy. Claire will take his suggestions very seriously. Let's now look at some other ways to soften recommendations in order to appear less bossy. And let's start off by listening to that last clip again.
I would take that. I also think, you might want to look at some of the imagery and think about perhaps simplifying that.
Mark softens what he says with the word perhaps. He also uses the very cautious phrase, you might want to look at. Listen again.
I would take that. I also think, you might want to look at some of the imagery and think about perhaps simplifying that.
Mark could also have said,
You could possibly think about the imagery.
You could possibly think about, you might want to look at. Let's now look at one more word that you can use to soften your recommendations in order to make you seem less bossy. I'm not going to tell you what this word is, but see if you can guess from the following clip.
Just a way that engages the audience more, because everything's very, very similar.
Right, so a bit of signposting.
Yeah, so just to lead the people through the audiences through the content. It's just about really helping them know.
Yeah.
Did you guess? The word is just. Mark is using just to explain the reasons for his suggestions. Don't forget that there is more information about the language in today's programme and a downloadable quiz on the how-to webpage on bbclearningenglish.com. You might want to take a look.
That was How To with bbclearningenglish.com.
Okay, very well. Now I hope that you have attentively listened to the audio and you have found the answers to the questions. I understand that listening to the native speakers is not easy, especially when you are still struggling with your language. But learning language actually is being exposed to its natural occurrences. So the more you listen to it, the better proficient speaker you will become. I make it a point that after 2-3 lectures, you listen to the native speakers so that you can become a proficient speaker and you can improve your listening skills. Okay, now let's look at the questions once again, and I hope you have found the answers to these questions. So I read them out and I would see if you can answer them. Question number 1 is, who makes recommendations to Claire? What's your answer? Yes, that's right. It's Claire's boss and his name is Mark. Okay, second question is, what are these recommendations about? What are these recommendations about? The right answer is, these recommendations are about a new website design. In fact, Claire has developed a new website and she is seeking advice from her boss about the design of that website. Okay, the next question is, what structures are used for making these recommendations? Alright, let's look at these structures. One of the structures that was used in this audio clip is you want, or what you want. Actually it means you need. What you want means what you need. What you need is to, and then you can give your piece of advice. What you need is to change the design of your website. What you need is to attract the audience more. Another structure that you listened to is you could or you would. You could pay attention to the color scheme, for example. You could give more time to the overall layout or format. Okay, the next structure is really interesting. What I would do is, we have learned the phrase, if I were you, I would do this. And the speaker here uses it slightly in a modified form, but in fact it has the same meaning. So what I would do is has the same meaning as if I were you, I would do this. Okay, the last or one of the structures that you heard in this audio clip is you could have, right? You could have. And after could have, you need the third form of the verb. So you could have paid more attention. You could have changed the color styles, etc., etc. Okay, the next question was, when is it useful to be vague while recommending something? I have changed why into when. When is it useful to be vague while recommending something? The answer is, it is useful to be vague when you suggest a change but cannot recommend anything specific or anything definite. Very often it happens, someone seeks advice from you and you ask him or her to make changes in his or her document or his or her work, but you do not have any definite idea how that could be done. So in that case, you can be a little vague. But sometimes you use vague construction in order to be polite. Because if you give a piece of advice directly, it might be considered rude in some situations, unless the person is seeking advice. It is, if you are giving advice and you are using strong words, very clear-cut instructions, then it's not like recommending, it's like ordering or commanding. So perhaps, maybe you could do this, perhaps you could do this. These phrases we can use in order to be a little vague. Okay, the last question is, what's the major difference between giving instructions and recommending? What's the major difference between giving instructions and recommending? Yes, your answer is right. When you give instructions, you sound bossy. You actually use imperatives. You use action words. So it might sound like you are giving, you are commanding, or you are giving orders. Whereas recommendations are more polite, and you use, sometimes you even use indirect ways of recommending it, like, if I were you, I would do this. If I were you, I would go to Karachi. If I were you, I would take some medicine. So the major difference between giving instructions and recommending is that while instructions, for instructions we use bossy language, we use imperative sentences. For recommendations, we are less certain, we are less sure, and we use certain, you can say, polite phrases and expressions. Okay, so we have done with these questions. Now let's move on. All right, now that you have listened to the audio, you have answered the questions, you have learned the key phrases for giving advice and also asking for advice. Now, like before, we are going to look at practice situations. And once again, I would like you to find a partner. Try to act out these situations with your partner. Okay, so here are some situations for practice dialogues. Learning English. That means you want to learn English. You feel weak either in reading or writing or speaking or listening or vocabulary or grammar. In one of the aspects of English, you feel weak, and you seek advice on it. And then your partner, he gives advice to you what you should do if you want to learn English. Okay. The next situation is about dieting. All right. Suppose that you are gaining weight. Your eating habits, your sleeping habits, or your work habits are not really very helpful in reducing weight. So you go to a doctor, or maybe you go to a friend, and then you seek advice on how you can be thinner, how you can be a bit slim, or how you can control your obesity, depending on your different situations. But mainly you will express your problem about dieting and about obesity, rather I should say, and then your partner would give you advice about it. Okay, the next situation is that you want to get a scholarship, and you ask some professionals' advice on that. Maybe you can make a telephone conversation for this one. All right. In the next situation, you want to go abroad. You have never been abroad before, and you are talking to someone who is experienced, who has been abroad, and you want seek advice from him or her. finding a job. You have just graduated and you want to find a job which is suitable, which is lucrative, and that gives you satisfaction. So share this problem with someone and seek advice on it. Okay, like before, these practice situations are only to give you some suggestions. In fact, this is not an exhaustive list, and you can add to it if you want to. It could be about any problem. We daily face problems and we need or seek advice on various issues. So don't just look at these 5 situations. In fact, you can think of any other situations and you should practice in it. And once again, I would emphasize that this is the most important part of all my lectures. Just listening to my lectures, just noting down the key phrases or the guidelines is not enough. The real learning starts when you actually practice it in real life situations. And for that, you need to work on your own. If you can recall, in lecture 1 we talked about managing your own learning, the pace of your learning, and the activities that you engage yourself in, they should be controlled by you yourself. And that can only be done if you actively participate in it, and if you practice it at home, at your workplaces, and find someone with whom you can do these dialogues. Okay. In the beginning, if you don't feel comfortable, you can write down the script of your dialogue, and gradually when you feel more confident, you can start without the complete script, and you can merely look at some notes, and afterwards you can even do away with the notes and you can do the dialogue straight away. But do practice it. Okay. And as I told you earlier, that for your quizzes, assignments, and your sessionals, there is a weightage, and of course you have to do that. But for most of these practice situations, maybe you are not given any marks, maybe you are not given any points. But the real purpose of this course is to improve the proficiency of your English language. And therefore, you should actually practice it, and even if there is no weightage in the exam, this is the real meat of the lectures, and this is that will really help you learn the language. Okay, with this we come to the end of this lecture. Let's look at the summary of lecture number 9, what we learned, and we will also repeat the key points here. In lecture number 9, we learned how to ask for advice. We learned various phrases that are useful. We also learned on how to give advice. We learned how to give and take recommendations from someone. You listened to a native speaker through an audio clip, and you also learned how to offer your help when someone is in trouble, when someone is facing a problem. And I hope that after completing this lesson and doing all the exercises in it, you should be able to give and seek advice in future. And since it is very important in our professional lives, as teachers we are also career counselors, and very often we have to suggest ways for our students on how to study, how to find a scholarship, how to do something. One of the things, for example, in which students often seek your advice is, "Sir, how can I improve my pronunciation? How can I improve my writing skills? How can I improve my marks in theory or in practical? Right? And very often they ask you which subject they should study. In 9th and 10th classes, for example, sometimes they seek your advice whether they should study computer science or whether they should study biology. Right? So as teachers, as mentors, we often need to give advice, and in our class we shouldn't only instruct or teach in English, but actually we should do all this career counseling and advising in English. Only then we will really become proficient in English. Okay, offering help is also very important. Merely giving advice is not enough. And for offering help, the phrases that you can use is should I. Instead of should you, you will say should I. Should I do this? Should I do that? Like, should I bring a cup of tea for you? Should I bring a cup of coffee for you? Should I search the content for you? Should I look at your assignment? All right, so these are all offers, and with this we come to the end of this lecture number 9. I will just repeat few points here. Lecture 9 is about asking for advice and giving advice. And being teachers, it is important that we ask for advice, and we give advice. And very often we have to give advice in our classes, and very often we have to recommend, make many recommendations for our students. In the end, I would also like to talk a little bit about the strategy that we are using in these lectures. You remember in the first 2 lectures I almost spoke in Urdu, and you felt pretty comfortable. And then I started using English, but gradually and slowly. And then now you find out that these days, I mean in these lectures, I am using English throughout. So some of you might not feel comfortable with it, but my advice to you is I recommend, I suggest that you keep on listening, you keep on paying attention. Even if you do not understand 100%, it is still worth it. You should actually be patient. You should be consistent. And even if you can understand only 20%, 30% of what I am saying or what the audio clips are saying, you should still be persistent. The whole thing is that you should feel encouraged, and you should not be disappointed. If you can recall, in lecture 1 I did talk about this strategy. Maybe some of you don't feel comfortable with it, but the point is that if you want to learn swimming, you have to jump in the swimming pool. And if you have to learn driving, you have to sit in the driving seat. If you will be afraid of the accidents, if you will be afraid of drowning in water, then probably you are never going to learn. Unfortunately, we have to make up for a lot of situations. The ideal lecture would be, in fact, ideally for functional English course we shouldn't have a lecture. But I'm trying my best that I expose you to various kinds of language expressions. I expose you to the native speakers, and I also give you practice situations, and I try to include interactive exercises and activities in my presentation so that you are involved, and you are not merely listening to my guidelines. You are not merely passively viewing these lectures, but instead you are actively involved in it. So while you are listening to these lectures, you should actually note down a lot of things. You should actively participate in it by doing all the exercises, by paying attention, and by even asking questions. And you can ask questions in LMS, or you can send an email, whichever the process there is that you can follow. With this, we come to the end of lecture number 9. Hope that it has been really beneficial for you, and in future you will feel confident and you would feel quite fluent whenever you need to seek advice from someone or whenever you are giving advice to someone. So with these words, I say thanks and I say goodbye to you, and hope to meet you again in the next lecture. Thank you very much.